But I think for Christian parents, showing your kids, here's the evil in the world. There is all this. And so there are things that are fearful.
Right.
There are enemies of God. There are tyrants. There are dragons. There are dark forces. All of that's real. And you want to show them that it's real. And but it all needs to come from a place of deep confidence in the promises of God and his goodness towards you. So it's like, there's giants in the land, but God said he'd never leave us or forsake us.
Yes.
And we're surrounded by people who also believe that.
Right.
And so we're, so God's got us. Right. And so then now it's like you can be honest about the thing that's fearful, but you're not fearing it.
Fear has become one of the world's most reliable currencies. Few motivators rival its power to foster dependency, whether on sensationalist news, tyrannical policies, or ideological movements promising salvation in exchange for our silent compliance. Today, fear-mongering is a trillion-dollar industry, thriving on a society conditioned to obsess over looming disasters. The formula is clear. Present a crisis too vast to solve alone, and invite us to surrender power and trust to the benevolent experts who claim they alone hold the cure. In the hands of the fearful, every thought, desire, and affection bends towards surrender, leaving people vulnerable to the subtlest forms of tyranny. Today's culture has its assigned fears: climate catastrophe, Chinese viruses, masculinity, ethnicity, fertility, suffering, even the faintest whiff of social disapproval, and being cancelled. It all sounds like a dystopian trope. But here we are, living out the genre. A man too fearful to challenge lies inevitably grows enslaved to them. I remember a wise mentor once saying, "Fear is faith in the enemy," reminding me that fear is, at its core, a worship disorder. And worshipping fear poisons freedom and chokes flourishing. In today's conversation, I'm joined by Joe Rigney, Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews College and author of Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. Dr. Rigney's work explores the forces shaping our emotions and decisions, illuminating how courage can free us from fear's grip. Previously, he served as professor and president of Bethlehem College and Seminary, pastor at Cities Church, and teacher at Desiring God. An ever-curious generalist, he has a passion for teaching on topics from C.S. Lewis and Shakespeare to biblical theology and political philosophy. When he's not exploring ideas, Joe's coaching high school football, playing baseball with his 3 sons, or spending cherished time with his wife, Jenny. Joe Rigney, welcome to Of Flames and Crowns.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. I kind of mentioned to you just before we got here that this is probably going to be about the most amount of time we've spent together since I've arrived in Moscow.
Since you moved here. That's how it always goes.
So, man, I'm really, really glad that I get this opportunity with you. I think this is going to be a good topic and an important one. So today we're going to be talking about the politics of fear. What is it about fear that holds such a sway on people today? Yeah,
so fear is one of the kind of core passions. So passions are sort of our impulsive and instinctive, semi-voluntary. I say semi-voluntary because you don't choose to be afraid or you don't choose to be happy.
Right.
But you can cultivate certain mindsets that foster it. So semi-voluntary impulses that are often very potent, especially passions tend to be overwhelming. They're the sort of thing that when they get going, cloud the mind, make it hard to think straight. So we talk about being blinded by fear or blinded by anger or blinded by desire. So fear, anger, desire, sadness would be kind of sort of the basic sort of passions, and then you have various sort of combinations. So they tend to be overwhelming, and therefore they're potent motivators. They kind of make the world go round. And so even listening to your opening monologue there is a sense of the old saying about Never let a good crisis go to waste, which I think was Rahm Emanuel, political operative for the Democrats, who basically said crises are opportunities to get things done that you couldn't otherwise do, which makes sense, right? So if somebody comes into the room and says, the building's on fire, we have to leave now, you don't pause to say, well, let's have an argument about it. Let's have a parliamentary debate about whether or not leaving is the appropriate course of action. The crisis means you just go.
Right.
So stoking crises is one way that people find useful to motivate, not just for and that's true whether there's actually is a crisis or not.
Right.
So there's all sorts of historical examples. Maybe we'll get into some of them where smart people have figured out that if we can frame an issue in a certain way, it awakens fear and it proves fruitful in getting things done that we couldn't get done if we just tried to make persuasive arguments.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm prompted to ask now, is there anything like a good sort of fear, a healthy sort of fear?
Yeah, sure. So passions are good.
Yeah.
They're given to us by God. They're meant to be governed by reason.
Yeah.
Okay, so passions are this sort of middle tier, instinctive, impulsive thing that's meant to be governed by reason. But because they operate often on such a quick trigger, it's how you stay alive, right?
Yeah.
So, your snap reaction whenever you see something coming at you and you just swerve the car real fast, your brain maybe didn't even register what it was. Your body kicked into gear to keep you alive.
Right.
So that's at sort of like a physical level. But in other cases, that impulse is something that's designed by God to serve our survival. So there is a good kind of fear, both at a base level and then at a larger sort of or deeper soul level. In the Bible, you have holy fear and unholy fear.
Right.
You have fear of the Lord. Don't fear so we're exhorted in Isaiah, don't fear what the nations fear.
Right.
Instead, fear the Lord.
Yes.
And so there's a kind of, and their fear seems to be more than just this kind of impulsive snap reaction to God, but instead something more like reverence, a sort of settled awe, a settled reverence for who God is that actually brings a kind of calmness, as opposed to abject terror or panic. So, and at the same time, you do have a number of instances in the scriptures where, an angel shows up and they hit the deck.
Right.
And it's, and they're like, hey, no, don't worship me. Fear God. Don't fear me. But there's a kind of initial impulsive, this is overwhelming. And that response is demanded. But of course, there are good kind of fears. And I think this is actually one place where Christians actually get manipulated. Today is nobody wants to be seen as fearful. To be seen as fearful is to be perceived as weak. Right. It's a kind of weakness. What are you so afraid of? Come on, Christian. And so I think liberals have liberals or Christian moderates often wield this against, in some cases, conservatives who say, "Oh, you're afraid the Democrats are going to get in power and do this, that, or the other. You should be governed by faith, not by fear." And it's a steering wheel,
right?
Because it's like, the question is not am I afraid? It's are my fears reasonable? And so that's one question: is my fear reasonable? Is the thing that I'm afraid might happen likely to happen? And then the second question is the action I'm trying to take in order to prepare for it a reasonable action? Is this a good way to kind of prepare for this bad thing that may come? But those require arguments as opposed to, hey, you're just being a scaredy cat. Stop being a scaredy cat, Christian. Shouldn't you just trust God?
Right.
When someone does that, that's usually a sign that they're trying to manipulate you.
Yes, of course. I think a lot of us have been on the receiving end of that.
Right.
Something, one of two things about manipulation as well, right? You wrote a whole book on it.
Yes.
And I mean, kind of coming to this interesting question as well, it seems that this idea of fear to some degree in relation to manipulation really has infiltrated Christian quarters. Why is this the case? And why does it seem to take a very similar shape to what you see the world doing?
Right. So then, even to kind of flesh out what I said a second ago, there's sort of two ways that fear becomes a tool of manipulation. One is by stoking it.
Right.
Okay. So you stoke the fear. So whether it's, in your monologue, you mentioned climate change or nuclear war or various other kinds of issues that would be sort of political hot buttons that, if we don't do X, Y bad thing will happen.
Right.
So that's one. And so in the grip of fear, again, you don't argue about leaving the building when it's on fire.
Yes.
You just go. So that's sort of one way that fear is used to get you to do something.
Right.
On the other hand, if you're in the position of going, hey, I think that this bad thing is going to happen, and therefore I'm taking action to prepare it, another kind of person who doesn't want you to prepare for it, who doesn't want you to take that course of action, is going to come along and say, hey, you're being governed by fear. Fear is running your life. Don't be a scaredy cat.
Right.
And so in both cases, so in one case, you have an excess of fear. Right, fear's being stoked in order to manipulate you.
Right.
In the other case, your reasonable fears are being dismissed as a way of steering you by a different fear. So that's what's funny about it is it's like it's a fear. It's a reputational fear.
Yes.
So if we're going to call you names, you're unfaithful, you're faithless, you're not trusting God, you're governed by fear, and you don't want that reputation, and therefore you stop doing whatever it is that they wanted you to stop doing.
Right.
But in both cases, so in one case, it's a fear of a reputation. In the other case, it's fear of whatever the thing is, the scary crisis, that are being used, and they're just very effective. Like so,
Yes.
So why do people do them? Because it works.
Yeah.
I mean, and so part of the thing, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, at some point, is cultivating certain sort of mental and spiritual habits and steadiness that enable you to not be steered by your fears.
Yes.
But instead to make wise, good, faithful decisions that recognize, yes, something scary is coming, but I'm not going to be overwhelmed by it. I'm going to trust God, but I'm also going to act.
Right. And we absolutely need to get into that subject. So we do live in a world that loves to prey on fear in a big way. You see this in your mainstream news media.
Yeah.
You spoke a moment ago about how liberals also use that as a baiting tool of sorts. What aspects of fear have earned your greatest concerns as far as fear mongering goes?
Yeah. So there's this. So in the early 20th century, I think it was William James wrote an essay called "The Moral Equivalent of War," in which he said basically what James realized is that war is actually a very useful thing for cultivating certain virtues. The wide-scale organization, people just kick into gear, sacrifice for the cause, willingness to endure hard things. So there's sort of martial courage, martial virtues that he recognized are really valuable. But war's terrible.
Yeah.
We don't want war.
Yeah.
And so what he said is what we need to do is discover a moral equivalent of war that can sort of accomplish the same ends, get people to, jump to it, and then, do what we need them to do, sacrifice what we need them to sacrifice, but without all of the bloodshed.
Yeah.
Okay. And since then, I think that the 20th century was basically, you had your actual wars. So you had World War I, World War II. You had various other conflicts, the sort of things that went on in communist countries in the middle of the 20th century. So you had that, but then you also had other attempts. So a war on poverty.
Right.
A war on drugs, the war on climate change. All of these were basically downstream from that basic idea, which is if we want to reorganize society to attack certain social ills, and people are being stubborn and aren't doing what we say, if we can frame it as a war, as an existential crisis, then people will, there won't be any more debates about what's good and right. People will just obey. They'll just do what we want. I think climate change is probably the one that's been most persistently, at least in the last 40 years, used in this way, which I think is ironic. And so here's like one way to think about this. I think it amuses me that governments will say things like, there are certain things that government just can't do. These are intractable problems that we'll never be able to solve. Like we'll never be able to secure the border. Right? We'll never be able to have a functioning immigration system that keeps certain people out and other people in. Like this is just an impossible problem. We can't solve it. And you go, oh, wow, okay. Well, what are you guys going to do instead? We're going to try to change the climate of the entire planet. And it's sort of like that's the equivalent of a kid saying, I would like to do advanced calculus, but they can't do basic arithmetic.
All right.
Okay, they want to do upper level college courses, and they're still in second grade.
Right. They can't solve the problems right in front of them.
Yes, they can't solve the basics, and yet they're wanting to go on to advanced stuff. Why do they want to go on to advanced stuff?
Yeah.
Because if it's this existential crisis, it requires a centralized, top-down bureaucracy that gets into the minutia of everything. Every aspect of your life comes under their power.
Yes.
And so, and most people, especially a lot of, I would say Americans, have a default aversion to that. We don't want to be told what to do. Yeah. So in order to overcome that sort of natural American independence, you've got to frame something as this existential crisis. The planet's going to, decay, and we're all going to die. Yeah. The ice caps are going to melt. We're all going to drown. The polar bears are toast. All of these sort of things are ways of stoking a certain kind of fear. Now, the problem is, this is where one element of the whole politics of fear becomes a double-edged sword. It does work until it doesn't, because it's sort of like the boy who cried wolf. Right? The boy who cried wolf, it was appealing to fear. Everybody wake up, there's a wolf, there's a wolf, and everybody wakes up. And because he wasn't telling the truth, eventually people stopped to believe him. And so actually right now, you have sort of two things operating, I think, in American politics, maybe globally as well. You see it, I think, in other countries. But you have the attempt to sort of stoke politics of fear coupled with a crisis of trust.
Yes.
Because people don't believe that the things that they're saying are actually as dangerous as they are. So on the far side of COVID, in which we're all supposed to be terrified, extreme measures, lockdowns, everybody's wearing masks outside, which everybody's going, I don't think that this is going to work. I don't think that this little piece of cloth is going to keep me. You guys never thought that before. And all the other ones you've said, no, that's not, viruses don't work that way. But now all of a sudden, but you can, and then the manifest arbitrariness of it. COVID apparently knows if you're outside at a rally, or is it an outdoor church service, or is it a rally for Black Lives Matter? Depending on which one, COVID knows. One of them, you're gonna be fine.
Exactly.
And the other one, it's deadly. And so they expended a lot of trust capital, making people do things that they wouldn't have normally done.
Absolutely.
And so now, if there was, this is actually the thing that when I think about what's scary to me, is that if there actually was some sort of really dangerous thing, that if early warning would lead people to take the kind of action that would save lives or preserve civilization. I think there's a lot of people who are just inclined to say, no, I don't trust you. Because they've expended that capital. They've cried wolf too many times on climate, the climate change thing. It was, by this year and everything's going to be bad. And then that year came and went. And then, in the next 5 years, the ice caps are going to be gone, and they're still around. All of these coastal cities are going to be underwater by 2015, and it's like they're still there. And then when things do show up that are sort of normal, they point to it and say, "See, climate change." It's like we've always had hurricanes. Hurricanes are just part of life. So they've expended the capital on a false story in order to gin up the power. And now people are not going to believe them anymore. And so that's the kind of that's the difficulty I see in the present moment. And I think what a lot of people are trying to figure out, which is itself a kind of anxious activity, is who do I trust? I need to find authorities. I need to find experts whose opinions, who've proven, have a track record of giving it to me straight, of neither exaggerating nor underplaying. And people are just kind of searching for that. Who's reliable? So that if something happens, what news sources do you go to? Which experts do you consult? And I think that what you're seeing is a big sorting of that, and largely along ideological lines. And that can be a little bit of an unnerving thing.
So Joe, in a world that has been conditioned to love and live by lies, do you really think that there is capacity, or that people have already started to see through some of these attempts to manipulate people, or do you think that something like COVID could happen again? I mean, and I say this just even when I think about conservative circles and the kind of rhetoric that they employ, they seem to some degree, at least some of them, have bought into some adherence to the climate thing, for example, right? So I'm wondering where you see that righteous resistance to this fear-mongering, and whether you think this culture that loves lies has really started to wake up to the reality that they, in fact, have believed a lie.
Yeah, so I think part of what you're seeing right now, what people call the Great Sort, which really did accelerate post-2020, post-COVID, post-riots, is basically people sorting into groups. In America, it's sorting into states where there's going to be a critical mass of people who are going to interpret events in a similar fashion, right? So that there will be a more natural coordination. It won't be as big of a clash. Now, there's still obviously people. It's not a uniform thing,
right?
But I think that's a desire to be able to live in a community that will respond to crises in a more coherent fashion, as opposed to this kind of real jarring thing where all of a sudden, one set of neighbors were all in on everything, and the other set of neighbors was going, I don't know about this, and that's really uncomfortable for people. It created clashes, and in some cases created legal issues. People got arrested. People got and people said, I don't need to deal with that. And so I think we'll continue to see that sort of thing. I think any further crises will prompt a further sorting.
Right. Okay.
I think this is what people are going to want to be around others who sort of see the world the same way that they do, and respond to crises the same way that they do.
Right.
And so I would expect that to continue. I also think it is creating an environment though for shysters and hucksters who will play on people's fears.
Right.
And maybe it will be, and it'll be opposite fears. So instead of climate change, it'll be fears of one world government and other sorts of things like that. That will be, and the difficult thing there is that everybody's attitude right now is, I need some new conspiracy theories because all mine came true.
Yeah.
And so it leads to a kind of like wider, like the range of what people actually think could happen or is happening. I mean, I find this sometimes to go, wow, that's even out there for me, and I have a pretty high tolerance, I think, for plausibility. Yeah, that can, I don't know, but that seems like it's not plausible. I think one of the things that people really the self-sorting is, I think, an important move, because what it does, it's a way of shoring up trust. Being in a community where you feel like I can trust the people around me, I can rely on them if things go belly up. I'm not on my own. I'm not, and I think that there's a kind of security in that at even just a basic level that people crave and kind of go, okay, if everything went belly up, I don't know if I'd be okay, but I would be better off than if I was on my own.
Yeah. When we started this conversation, you had made some reference to passions.
Yeah.
I want to just have you flesh that out a little bit more.
Okay.
In terms of those core passions that tend to evoke fear, or that fear is anchored on to some degree.
Yeah. So fear. So again, the snap reactions that we have, animals have these, right? So when a rabbit sees your dog, it bolts. Or it freezes. Why? Because it has this sort of snap judgment. Wolf, that wolf, your dog, right, is dangerous, and therefore reacts accordingly. So the passions are sort of things that we tend to. There's a lot of overlap with how animals operate. What animals lack that humans possess is a higher order of reason and choice. When it comes to the passions. Okay. So, but when people are in the grip of a passion, it sort of overrides that higher level reasoning. And so the scary thing out there, the thing that is frightening, awakens the fear in here, and then we typically have sort of, fight, freeze, or flee. Those are sort of the three basic, like in the grip of the passions, those are the ways that human beings respond, and different folks respond different ways. So, and so that's that. And so all of those are sort of like these actions that are not made because of necessarily a rational decision, but simply because of the snap judgment, snap reaction. That's what I mean by passion. And so, and I think the other thing is, I think that keeping people in a constant state of flinch, in a constant readiness for something terrible,
Right.
Makes you if you're in that kind of constant anxious state, you are very manipulable. And so there's vested interest in keeping people sort of jumpy. And again, at the most fundamental level, trust God. Yeah. So a lot of it is, I think another element of this, like at a macro civilizational level, is there's ways in which our technologies and our scientific advancement have tricked us into thinking that the world is more controllable than it actually is. And there's a kind of aspiration to deity under we can control the climate. We can control all of these things. And because we've been successful in certain respects, we've been able, they did build a city in a swamp that is known to flood. And we think, we should be able to do that.
Yeah.
And therefore, if the levees fail, like they did in Hurricane Katrina, 15, 20 years ago, if the levees fail, we think something's gone massively wrong. It's like, we built a city in a swamp. Like, what? This is kind of crazy, right? Like most, older generations would have gone, I just don't think that's going to go well for you. But we thought through our technologies and our technical prowess that we could actually do it. So that sense of control that we have, because our most of our environments are humanly constructed and designed to serve human needs. When all of a sudden they stop doing that, when sort of nature breaks through and shatters it, we're like it's not just that the walls got knocked down. It's that our mental story of where we thought we were gets knocked down. You're kind of back in that state of nature. I'm sure that there's people right now, with the flooding that was in North Carolina and Tennessee with the recent hurricane, who all of a sudden, that's the sort of the narrative collapse that comes, is like, how could this happen? We thought that we were past it, but we're not. Like, we're still very fragile. And so that's where a humility before God and the world that he made, a fallen and broken world in which bad things happen, natural disasters happen, and in which there are malevolent forces at work behind the scenes. A belief in a world of other agencies, is a kind of humbling thing. So you go, why do these things happen? Well, God is judging us, or demonic forces are attacking us. Like those are all on the table, and those aren't necessarily things that you can't fully control. So there's a kind of humility there. So there's that. And then, again, surrounding yourself with people who have your back and that you can rely on in a pinch and aren't going to abandon you and look out for themselves merely in a crisis, are all ways that we kind of try to buttress the vulnerability that we feel.
That's very good. I love that. Joe, do you think that fear-mongers are simply projecting their own fear, or that there's something sinister, intentionally sinister in what they're trying to do? Of course, this is a very general question, but as it refers to, I suppose, a political realm of sorts, do you think that it happens to be an inadvertent thing, or do you think there's an intentionality to it?
Yeah, it's a real tough question to answer. I'm sure that it does vary from person to person. But if you take something like, this is my read on something like the climate stuff. I think that it'd be really easy to think these people know it's all bunk, but they're just trying to manipulate us. And I tend to think that's maybe there's some people that are like that. But I actually think that there's a good number of them who are true believers. They really they believe their computer. Like, and this is the part of the thing. Their computer model is more real to them than the fact that their former predictions have all failed to come true. Right. So, but so they just tweak the model rather than adjusting the model to reality. And I think that there's a hubris in thinking that all of the factors that you need to understand, like whatever data they're putting into the model, they think they've covered all the factors. And it's like the world is way more complex, I think, than they give it credit for. But I think that they're in many cases motivated by a sincere desire to save humanity or something like that. So you have that, but then sort of operating in that same frame is a fear of being ostracized from others like you. And so if you were, for example, to be working with those kind of models, and you discover that the math doesn't work, that there's something missing, that you keep putting the data in and it's not coming out the way you expect, and so you begin to suspect that our modeling is wrong. Now there's a different, so you're not afraid of climate change. Now you're afraid of the other scientists who, if you challenge the consensus, are going to steer you back in line by threats of ostracism.
Right.
And so it's a social thing. It's groupthink.
Yes.
Right. And groupthink is fear motivated all the way down.
Right.
I don't want to be out. It's the old psychological experiments where they would have, it'd be 12 people in a room, 11 of whom are in on it. One guy's not. And they're going through and they're doing a math problem, and it says 2 + 2, and they keep saying 5, and everybody says 5, or which line is longer than the other, and one of them is manifestly longer, and people keep saying the wrong one.
Right.
And how many people, by the time the subjects get to them and say the wrong answer in order to conform to what everybody else is doing?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like it's that sort of thing. Don't get put out of don't be out of line.
Yeah.
That becomes a high motivator, and therefore they go along with it. I think that's a lot of what's going on. For example, like another area where they're expending trust capital unnecessarily is when it comes to the men can become women trans stuff,
of course. Yeah.
right? I think there's a whole bunch of people who know if you could get inside their heart and get inside their mind and see what's going on, think this is crazy. But groupthink and social pressure keep everybody silent,
right?
Because they don't want to raise trouble. They don't want to raise a stink,
right?
Which is also, and because fear is contagious. The Bible talks about this actually in Deuteronomy when it's talking about laws for warfare. One of the things that the generals are supposed to do is, hey, if anybody here is afraid and weak of heart, go home.
Right.
And the reason is because we don't want to be in the middle of a battle and a bunch of you cowards run.
Yeah.
And because fear is contagious,
Right.
you cause the heart of your brother to melt just like yours.
Right.
We'd rather have less soldiers, but soldiers who aren't afraid, than a bigger army with cowards. And so cowardice is contagious, but so is courage. So this is the sort of the lesson of the Emperor Has No Clothes story is that the little kid he's immune to the social pressures, right? Like the whole point of that story is little children don't pick up on the cues of you're not supposed to say that, and so he just said he doesn't have anything on, and all of a sudden that pops the little bubble, and now everybody can admit it.
Yeah.
What they've all been thinking in their own head, they can now admit. So courage can be contagious too, which I think is a little bit of what we see sometimes today when people finally go enough, and then all of a sudden there's kind of like a rallying point in relation to some of these hot buttons that say, no, we're going to question this. We're going to ask can I ask questions?
Right.
And all of a sudden when you start to see the mechanism at work where no, you're not allowed to. Questions are unwelcome. This is what happened during COVID.
Yes.
The scientists who were shut down and censored, who were saying, okay, this is a virus, but I'm not sure that the ways we're doing it are the best ways, and these are not the best mitigating. There'd be better ways to approach it, and all that sort of stuff. And they were just shut down. That makes a bunch of people go, wait a minute. If this was all a rational fear, and if this was a rational fear, and if these are reasonable actions to take. Why would we have to shut it down?
Yeah. Exactly.
Why do you have to shut down dissent?
Right.
Maybe it's not what I'm thinking, and that's caused people to kind of question stuff.
Right.
And then they're anxious because now they're like, well, now I don't know. I think there's a lot of people who haven't quite known how to make the shift from trusting a general societal consensus. We trust our medical experts. We trust our government policy experts. We trust we trust. And then all of a sudden they're going, well, I don't think I can anymore because they're telling me boys can become girls and that masks stopped COVID and that the vax was safe and all of these different things. And so they're going, now what do I do? And so they're starting to kind of grasp, and some of them are going to grasp for kooks. Yeah. Right. They're going to end up grasping for kooks.
Right.
Because they're not part of the consensus doesn't mean they're right.
Right.
There's also other kinds of stupid.
Exactly.
But it's an anxious sort of place to be, and learning to develop the habits of heart and mind that can live with that uncertainty. That's again part of I'm a human.
Yes.
I'm not all knowing. I'm not all powerful. But I am responsible to God, and that's actually I think a big thing that's worth reflecting on is a recovery of an appropriate sense of human agency. So I think sometimes what people can feel is that the world is so big, so complex, so overwhelming. Part of the reason that they go along with some of the nonsense is it feels better to outsource my agency. To just be just go with the flow.
Yeah.
And just, okay, let them decide. Rather than taking responsibility for themselves.
Yeah.
Right. That's an easier out. And oftentimes there's both the fear motivator and then the bribe motivator.
Right.
So, right now we're in the middle of a presidential election in which one party is running advertisements threatening to take away the other party, if they get elected, will take away your porn.
Right.
Well, that's a bribe, right?
Yeah.
It's like, hey, porn and abortion are bribes.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not going to infringe upon you. So and they're, Chesterton said the kind of freedom that progressives are often interested in is the kind of freedom that you could exercise in an 8x10 cell. Right, it's the sort of thing you can look at porn, you can smoke your weed, and you can have your abortion, and you're in a little prison. Right, the kind of freedom that conservatives have tended to be more interested in is a freedom to build a family, to start a business,
property.
to own property, to be in a place where you can say no.
Yeah,
and it's about dominion in the world. And so one side is sort of feeding a certain, we'll bribe you with these and scare you with others. So there's sticks and carrots. Yeah. And then the other side saying, no, you don't have to live that way.
Right.
And I think some people would choose that because it's the, I watched the original Matrix movie the other day.
Nice.
And that's what's going on there with the one character who betrays his friends. Is he's like, I'd rather just take the bribe. I'd rather just be in the Matrix hooked back up than to be free with all of the responsibility that comes with. Yeah. It's a great burden. Yeah. And so I think that one of the things that we have to encourage in people is you are responsible. You're responsible to God, and he's entrusted something to you. Right? You're a husband, you're a father. Like, you're responsible for this. You're responsible for your wife and your kids. You're responsible for your community. You have some responsibility to your neighbors, even to your state, your country. Like, you have responsibilities up and down here, and you can't shirk them. You can't shift them. You'll be held accountable for them. And so it's far better for you to cultivate the skills necessary, the skill, the honor, the courage, the strength in order to bear that burden well than it is to kind of collapse under the weight of it.
Right. Yeah, and I think one of the things that inhibits people from doing that oftentimes is fear of loss of some kind, a loss of reputation, a loss of friends, a loss of a livelihood. These are things that I've seen very pointedly. You referred to groupthink moments ago, and that immediately took me to identity politics and how even as I've seen the current political campaigns unfold, especially the Democrats, everything is anchored on identity politics.
Right.
If you're a woman, you have to vote this way or else.
Right.
If you're a black person, you have to vote this way or else. There's quite a lot of manipulation happening there. And it's interesting that now you just referred to personal responsibility as, I suppose, a sort of antidote to that. How do we begin to help people embrace that sense of personal responsibility collectively?
Yeah. So what you're describing there, the difference between what you might call, I think, artificial identities.
Yes.
And more organic or natural identities. Yes. And I want to when I talk about those in a minute.
Right.
It's not pure and simple natural, but but there is something different. Artificial identities are you have a uterus, and therefore you ought to think like all the other uterus havers. Okay, so women should all vote the same way because that's your fundamental identity. But it's a political identity, which is divorced from, well, what about your obligations if you're a woman to your father, if you're a daughter? What about to your husband, to your children? Do you have obligations in those ways? And how does that so that's the difference between an artificial one.
Yes.
You're simply a member of a class, an undifferentiated class of uterus havers.
Right.
Or you're a mother.
Yes.
You're a wife. You're a sister. You have these more organic bonds to your people.
Exactly.
The same thing, and the same thing's true of of race, where the color of your skin dictates where your allegiances should lie.
Right.
And for a long time, this has been a major issue in America because of the way that race was. So, what's ironic is. On the one hand, the progressives have always gone on about how race was socially constructed. Skin color was sort of this arbitrary thing, and it didn't actually, it wasn't always pure and simple skin color, because if somebody could have dark skin, but if you came from a different country and you weren't a slave or if you weren't descended from slaves. So there was all these sort of exceptions. It was never hard and fast.
Right.
It was all socially constructed.
Exactly.
But then rather than try to remove the social construction, they just wanted to try to flip it.
Yes.
And now what they're running up against is that they're actually feeding a kind of white identity politics where white people are going to go, well, if the game is identity politics and it's based on my skin color,
well,
if
we
we're
can
going to
play that game
then I guess we should develop a white ethnic identity and have an allegiance to people simply based on the melanin content. And it's also interesting because politically, we sort of break people down into sort of like 4 big ethnic groups, right? It's sort of like there's blacks and whites, and then there's Hispanics and Asians. And those are the 4. But if you that's the racial breakdown.
Right.
But sometimes they call it an ethnic breakdown. Yeah. But if you actually broke it down by ethnicity, Cubans and Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans and Colombians all have very distinctive cultures.
Exactly.
There's distinctive backgrounds and histories, and therefore they tend to vote different, right? Based on Cubans tend to be very different in terms of their political orientation than say Mexican Americans. So there's these subcategories, and then it's even true in terms of blacks, in terms of where they, what part of the country. Yes. Whites certainly have the similar sort of deal. So Asians, good grief, Japanese versus Chinese versus Korean. Those are not are not just Asian, and they all think alike.
Exactly.
But we want to sort of, again, sort them into these recognizable categories, because if we can get people to have that artificial racial identity, and then we know what buttons to push.
Yes.
Then, the button might be fear. This is, they're going to put y'all, Biden, or whatever I think it was, they're going to put y'all back in chains. Like that sort of stoking of the fear. Yeah. If we just push those buttons, then people will do what we want. That's, I think, one of the things about Trump is that he's been a disruptor of that.
Yes, he has, hasn't he? Yeah.
Because he kind of scrambles it, because you get people who are attracted to him for all sorts of different reasons that sort of scramble our classic ethnic ones. The alternative to, I think, those kind of artificial identity politics is a more natural, organic, and then add covenantal way of viewing the world. So that natural relations and covenantal relations are more fundamental, and is how you should weigh your allegiances. Right. So that means that your obligations to your spouse and your children, to your parents, honoring your parents, taking care of your own household. These are biblical obligations. But then your co-religionists. And your co-religionists who are in proximity to you, and therefore covenantally bound. So there may be sometimes that may overlap at times with ethnic identities, because if you live in Iowa or whatever, and it's all the people around you are downstream from Dutch immigration in the early 20th century or something, that dovetails. And so it's an optical illusion that this is an ethnic thing, but it's actually a cultural thing rooted in shared religion and shared history. Right. And so, but those kind of bonds are then more fundamental. So your bond to your fellow Christians, and so you begin to think in terms of responsibility, like tiers of responsibility. I'm most responsible for the members of my household. That's like God has entrusted my household to me. Yes. They work way out. It's Christians, the community of Paul says in Galatians, do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. Right. Yeah. So there's that especially is you want to do good to everyone, but there's an especially for other Christians, and there's an especially to other Christians who are proximate to you, right? Who are members of your church, other churches in your town. Then I think you work out, and you've got, and this is where it's not always cut and dried, because you do have maybe obligations to other Christians, even if they're far away, but you also have obligations to other non-believers who are close at hand. Yes. Right. And so sometimes that's where the navigate. So if you look at certain conflicts and you go, well, there's Christians on that side, and so I'm more bound to them at one level, but these non-Christians are closer proximity to me, and it gets gnarly. It requires wisdom to sort through. Right. But the point is that what you're not doing is you're not just checking skin color or whether or not someone has a uterus. Exactly. It's not. That's not the main driver of your allegiances and your loyalties. Your loyalties are covenantally defined and naturally defined. These are my kids, and I have an obligation to care for them. Doesn't mean that I can be cruel to other kids, but it means in terms of what has God entrusted to me, I need to take care of that. And then I think this is how my different concentric circles works, is fulfill your obligations here and work your way out, and trusting the Lord at every step of the way that He'll provide the resources necessary for you to do whatever good you want to do. But oftentimes we flip it, and you have that phenomenon we all know about, right? It's I love humanity. It's people I can't stand. So it's the sort of person who loves the abstraction. Right. And I think liberalism lends itself to precisely this problem, where it's like the climate folks who their model, their computer model, is more real to them than the actual like weather outside. Right. Like this thing trumps that.
Or the actual people they claim they're carrying.
Exactly. And it's the same thing. It's like this abstraction of humanity becomes more real. Yes. Or the distant, whether it's the immigrant or the poor or someone over there, is more real to them than the mother-in-law who lives in their house and they can't stand them. Yes. Right? Or their father who votes a different way than they do and therefore they cut him off. Yeah. Right? It's like those bonds just collapse under the weight of the abstraction. Yes. What's funny is like all of this is anticipated in Lewis. There's a section in That Hideous Strength where Mark Studdock, the sociologist, Lewis actually comments about how for Mark, his figures, when he's doing his sociology and doing his social scientific classifications, it says that was more real to him than going to the pub and seeing the actual people that his policy recommendations would affect. Right. Right. He like, in some ways, he recognizes that at some level. That's part of why he's savable, is he can still recognize like, hey, there's still a charm to this little village. Yes. Even if we have to liquidate it, right? I think the chapter's called "The Liquidation of Anachronisms." Yeah. And it's like, we have to liquidate the anachronisms, very scientific tech speak. But he recognizes that there's some attraction there. But what's more real to him is his data. Right. It's the data that becomes the thing. And that's I think a pretension. It's I want to be God. Yes. And therefore I'm going to try to control everything.
One way I've seen this is a journalist, using Africa as a context here. Yeah. In the middle of some village that's quite impoverished and is speaking about how climate change is going to affect future generations. Mm-hmm. Right. Like, so the context around them, like there are people who are in need right now. Right. But the framing of the entire conversation is we have to save a future sort of civilization.
A hypothetical situation. Exactly. And it's the common thread in all of those is it's future unnamed generations as opposed to your own children. Right. It's people over there as opposed to the people in your backyard. Right. The neighbor, the family member that you have trouble getting along with. All of which are basically rejections of the responsibility God's given you in favor of ones that you don't have. Right. Which again, to tie it back to, we can't solve immigration, a basic duty of government. Yeah. And therefore we're going to try to change the climate of the planet. Exactly. All of it is sloughing of responsibilities that God has given us in favor of ones that he hasn't, and that which we actually can't do. And therefore, but we can always aspire, we can always try, and in the meantime enrich ourselves and get a lot of power.
Yeah, exactly. Joe, now kind of talking through potential solutions. Okay. Let's say, for example, a young man who has discovered that he has lived in a world that has been manipulating him for a long time. It's easy for him to grow despondent. He may come across a Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate and think that's a way forward. What sort of counsel would you give to this young man as he starts to wake up to the reality that he has been lied to for such a long time?
Yeah, right. So I think one of the big things there is that guy needs to recognize on the one that not only has he been lied to, but he lies to himself. Because it's really easy to go look at all the ways that I've been lied to, right? And therefore, but to never have a similar skepticism of your own deceitful heart, right? And this is again where you can basically, it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, where you haven't actually steered anything differently. It just looks a little different. Right. And so what he can do is he can just substitute he was trusting in one expert or expert class or whatever, and now he's been disabused and he's woken up to it. Yeah. And instead he just substitutes another equally distant, equally detached, equally non-covenanted, unnatural one for another. And so he hasn't actually fundamentally altered his situation in terms of the bonds and community with which he's surrounded himself. Right. So the big thing that I would say is someone like that needs to be in embodied relationship with real flesh and blood people
Right.
who he can't hide from or manipulate as easily as he can online stuff. So the online stuff is fine as a supplement. It's a great blessing. It's one of the reasons you do podcasts like this. It's one of the reasons that Canon Plus and other things, we're trying to flood the zone with artillery for the culture war. But it's not a supplement can't become a substitute for the real thing. And the real thing is that embodied, enfleshed, covenanted, natural and organic community where you have, so it's not just, I need a mentor online.
Yeah.
It's like, go find a guy.
Right.
Right. My friend Michael Foster calls these sort of the clueless bastards, this clueless bastard generation.
Right.
Who on the one hand, they're fatherless, they're bastards.
Right.
And they don't know anything.
Yes.
And so then they look for gurus, right? So they're surrogate father figures, but they're father figures who are at a distance and aren't. And again, it's that could be helpful. You following the Jordan Peterson plan or some other guy that you found online who's put his life together and you're going to follow him could be a real blessing to you.
Right.
But it won't be a blessing to you unless it's actually sort of woven by God into real flesh and blood community. And you can test yourself by, well, whenever I go to a flesh and blood community, am I always hopping from one to one because it always goes south? Right. Every time a real pastor gets a hold of me, every time some real men, a men's group, I go there, I end up doing something and it's always, again, it's always their fault. And you just kind of are hopping and you begin to feel, man, the world's so hard, and you play the victim.
Right.
And so the victimhood thing, is it true that you've been wronged? Sure. Have you been born in a society that's totally broken on a whole host of evidence and you've been lied to? Great. Okay. Continuing to lie to yourself isn't going to get you out of that.
Right.
So find a place that you can plant some roots, find a place that you can be woven into a community and have your lies exposed. You have your falsehoods addressed, your rough edges pared down, so that you actually become the man that God wants you to be.
Yes.
That's going to be the solution. And if in the middle of that involves online, distant teachers and mentors as supplements, praise God, use them.
Right.
But don't make them a substitute for the real thing.
Absolutely. And how can people guard against projecting fear themselves? That might be a projection of fear to their own kids, to their own friends.
Right.
How should people be thinking about that?
I actually think this is, and I know that I've not read the book, but The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt that just came out, which talks, I think, about some of the ways that we feed the mental health crisis by burdening kids with things that they can't do anything about.
Yes.
So like, I think climate change is a great example, like scaring the bejesus out of kids because the world's going to come to an end and just creates anxiety, right? Anxiety. And then we wonder why they're acting out, why everything's going wrong, why they're medicating in all these different ways. And it's like, don't burden the kids with that. Good night. Like, and so I think Christians could do it. There's a similar sort of thing. There's, at one time there was sort of the dispensational version of this. The world's, Jesus is coming back in the next 5 years. And there's, and if you don't make it out of the rapture, you're going to be in for it, man. And so there's a certain kind of fear mongering that could come that way. But I think for Christian parents, being, showing your kids, here's the evil in the world. There is all this. And so there are things that are fearful.
Right.
There are enemies of God. There are tyrants. There are dragons. There are dark forces. All of that's real. And you want to show them that it's real. And but it all needs to come from a place of deep confidence in the promises of God and his goodness towards you. So it's like, there's giants in the land, but God said he'd never leave us or forsake us.
Yes.
And we're surrounded by people who also believe that.
Right.
And so we're, so God's got us. Right. And so then now it's like you can be honest about the thing that's fearful, but you're not fearing it. Which I think, I always use this as an example of kind of courage, because it's a surprising one. Normally we associate courage as a sort of masculine virtue, which at some level it is in terms of like physical courage.
Right.
But in the Bible, women show remarkable courage. And Sarah is a great example who's used by Peter in 1 Peter 3 as an example of courage. She's a holy woman, holy woman who hopes in God, and doesn't fear anything that is frightening.
Yes.
Right. And what form did her courage take? She submitted to Abraham, calling him Lord. So her submission to her husband was an act of faith and hope in God, not in her husband. It was a hope in God that overcame the fears. Well, what kind of fears? Well, Abraham comes home one day and says, "Hey, honey, we're leaving."
Yeah.
"Oh, where are we going?" I don't know.
I don't know yet.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So God's going to tell me
Right.
on the way.
Right.
"Oh, okay. So we're just leaving your family and my family and everybody we've ever known, and we're just going to go." He's like, "Yeah, that's what we're doing."
Yeah.
"Okay, and you don't know anything about the place that we're going?" He's like, "Well, I think there are tyrants and giants. And so you're going to need to pretend, we're not going to mention that you're my wife because the tyrants will try to take you. You're just my sister. Wait, so we're going to have to outfox tyrants who are going to try to take me into their harem?
Right.
We're going to that. That's the place that you're taking me?"
Yeah.
And yeah, honey, that's it. And she has to go, "Okay, you're my head. You're the head of this home.
Right.
I'm in."
Right.
Now, there's all kinds of frightening stuff in there.
Right.
But the point is she hoped in God and didn't fear anything that's frightening.
Right.
Okay? And she did good. What was the good that she did? She cared for Abraham's household. She was honored her husband, and then in the providence of God eventually raises Isaac to be the bearer of God's blessing for the world. And so these are major things, but it's also very, very mundane. And Peter says to Christian women, be like that woman. Be like her.
Right.
And then a similar sort of exhortation could be made to men. Be like Abraham.
Right.
Be like David. Like that sort of have that kind of covenantal faith. Be like Joshua, right? Moses has been God's dude, right? His arms are up. They win battles. His arms are up. The seas part. He wielded a staff and brought plagues on he was God's instrument. Right. And now he's dead. And we're going into a land filled with giants. Yeah. So what's the continual refrain that you hear in the end of Deuteronomy, beginning of Joshua? It's be strong and courageous. Why? Yes. Because the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Yeah. And I think this is actually a big antidote to one of the things that prompted that kind of European exploration and adventure seeking, as well as American sort of frontier, was a confidence that wherever we go on this planet, heaven's above us, hell's below us, and God is with us. Yeah. Right? In other words, wherever we go, we're in God's world and he's on the throne. There's never a place off the map where, and this is the Psalm 139, if I go up to heaven, you're there. If I go down into the depths of Sheol, you're there. If I should rise in the morning and get in a boat and go as far as I can across the other side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Yes. Your right hand will hold me fast. That kind of confidence overcame any fear of unknown, uncertain, unsafe, because it's God's got us. And so there's a deep confidence that then overcomes all the fears.
Wow. That's amazing. I think one way I could almost tie that up is the fear of God as the antidote to the politics of fear.
Amen.
Right?
Amen.
Joe, thank you. I think having spent this time with you, conversing with you, has been absolutely rich.
Yep.
We're determined to ride this battleship straight into war.
Yeah.
To raise the sails, to hoist the flag for kingdom, for eternity.
Amen.
So thank you so much, brother. Appreciate it.